Hello, and welcome back to the channel. Today we will explain the GED Social Studies test for you and give you a sample passage outlining how to answer questions. So be sure to stick around to the end as we will give you tips for each question. The GED Social Studies exam tests your ability to understand, interpret, and apply information across 4 key content areas: civics and government, 50%, U.S. history, 20%, economics, 15%, and geography, 15%. This exam doesn't just assess your memory of historical facts or governmental structures, but rather focuses on your critical thinking skills and ability to analyze social studies, related texts, and data. Imagine we're on a journey through time and space, where the past and present merge. The GED Social Studies exam is not merely a test of what you know, but how you understand and interpret the world and its complex history. It's about drawing connections across time and space, understanding the cause and effect in historical events, and discerning how these events shape our present and future. Consider this passage, for example, about the Civil Rights Movement, that focuses on the events leading up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The passage might detail the various forms of nonviolent protest and legal battles that characterize the movement, highlighting key figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and organizations like the NAACP. Let's review the passage together. Pay close attention to the title, as this also helps you to figure out key details like the main idea or even the author's intent. Sample passage: the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In the decade leading up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Civil Rights Movement utilized nonviolent protest and legal challenges to confront and dismantle systemic racial segregation and discrimination in the United States. Central to this movement were leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who advocated for peaceful demonstrations, and Rosa Parks, whose refusal to give up her bus seat became a pivotal act of protest. These actions, coupled with the legal efforts of organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, highlighted the deep-seated injustices and mobilized public opinion in favor of civil rights legislation. The movement saw a variety of nonviolent tactics in action, including sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, freedom rides through the South to challenge segregated interstate bus terminals, and the historic March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963, where King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. These protests drew national attention to the cause and pressured the federal government to act, laying the groundwork for legislative change. The culmination of these efforts was the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, one of the most significant legal achievements of the civil rights movement. This landmark legislation outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, ended unequal application of voter registration requirements, and prohibited racial segregation in schools, at the workplace, and by facilities that served the general public. The act was a testament to the effectiveness of the combined strategies of peaceful protest and legal action employed by the civil rights activists. Multiple-choice questions. Question 1. Drawing conclusions and making inferences. Based on the passage, which of the following best describes the primary strategy used by civil rights activists to achieve their goals? A. Armed rebellion. B. Nonviolent protest. C. Political lobbying. D. Economic boycotts. Pause and think. Consider how the activists aimed to bring about change and which methods were emphasized in the passage. For question 1, the correct answer is B, nonviolent protest. The passage details the civil rights movement's reliance on peaceful demonstrations, legal battles, and other forms of nonviolent protest to challenge racial segregation and discrimination, Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., as well as events like sit-ins, freedom rides, and the March on Washington exemplify this strategy. This question assesses the ability to draw conclusions from provided information, a key skill for the GED Social Studies test. Understanding the strategic choices of the movement requires critical thinking and the ability to infer the primary method of activism based on the actions and outcomes described. If you found yourself leaning towards a different answer, let's think through that together. For the first question, if you were considering option A, armed rebellion, it's essential to revisit the passage's emphasis. The civil rights movement is celebrated for its steadfast commitment to nonviolent protest. This means that their approach was about peaceful demonstrations and legal battles, rather than engaging in any form of armed conflict. It's a common misunderstanding, but when we closely examine the strategies outlined in the passage, it's clear that nonviolent protest was the cornerstone of their efforts. But what about C, political lobbying, and D, economic boycotts? Well, C might seem tempting because, sure, lobbying was part of their arsenal, but the passage highlighted nonviolent protests as the go-to method, making lobbying a secondary tactic rather than the primary one discussed. And D, while economic boycotts like the Montgomery bus boycott were crucial, the passage paints a broader picture of nonviolent protest strategies beyond just economic actions, hence why B, nonviolent protest, fits best as the primary strategy. Question 2. Analyzing historical events and arguments. Which of the following outcomes was a direct result of the civil rights movement as described in the passage? A. The abolition of slavery. B. The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. C. The start of the women's suffrage movement. D. The election of the first African American president. Pause and reflect. Link the described activities and efforts of the movement to their significant legislative outcomes. When you reflect on that, you will find that the answer here is B, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The passage directly links the activities of the civil rights movement, such as the March on Washington and the advocacy work of figures like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., to the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This demonstrates the ability to analyze historical events and understand their consequences, crucial for the GED Social Studies exam. Recognizing the connection between the movement's efforts and legislative outcomes requires the application of analytical skills to identify cause and effect relationships in historical contexts. Moving to question 2, if A, the abolition of slavery caught your eye, this might be due to a mix-up in timelines. The abolition of slavery happened long before the civil rights movement, through the 13th Amendment in the 19th century. The movement, as detailed in the passage, was primarily focused on dismantling the systemic racial segregation and discrimination prevalent in the mid-20th century, culminating in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Understanding the historical context can really help clear up any confusion here. Remember, that monumental achievement predates the civil rights movement by almost a century. What about C, the start of the women's suffrage movement, and D, the election of the first African American president? Well, the suffrage movement unfolded earlier in the 20th century, not directly connected to the movement's actions leading to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and while the election of the first African American president is a historical milestone, it's an event that happened decades later, not a direct outcome of the movement's efforts during the 50s and 60s. Question 3. Evaluating reasoning and evidence. The passage mentions the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. What was the significance of this event as illustrated in the passage? A. It led directly to the end of racial segregation in all states. B. It was the first time a civil rights protest had been held in Washington, D.C. C. It pressured the federal government to act on civil rights legislation. D. It marked the official end of the civil rights movement. Pause and analyze. Reflect on the role of the March on Washington in the broader narrative of the civil rights movement, as presented in the text. What's your answer? If you said C, you're correct. It pressured the federal government to act on civil rights legislation. The March on Washington is highlighted in the passage as a pivotal event that drew national attention to the civil rights cause and exerted pressure on the federal government to legislate against racial discrimination. This question tests the ability to evaluate the significance of historical events and their impact on legislative changes, a critical aspect of the GED Social Studies test. Understanding how the evidence presented in the passage supports the broader narrative of the civil rights movement's strategy and achievements involves comprehending and interpreting historical evidence. For the third question, considering A, it led directly to the end of racial segregation in all states, seems a bit too broad. The march was pivotal, but segregation's end was gradual and complex. And thinking it was B, the first time a civil rights protest had been held in Washington, D.C., overlooks prior protests. Lastly, D, it marked the official end of the civil rights movement, doesn't capture the truth either, as the movement continued in various forms beyond the march. Each question invites us to not just recall facts, but to engage critically with the material, applying historical knowledge and analytical skills to sift through the options provided. This process isn't just about finding the right answer, but understanding why other options don't fit, enhancing our grasp of the nuances in historical narratives and the complexities of social movements. These answers and their explanations showcase how to apply critical reading and thinking strategies to social studies content, emphasizing skills like drawing conclusions, analyzing historical events and arguments, and evaluating reasoning and evidence. These are integral to success on the GED Social Studies exam and involve more than memorizing facts. They require the ability to think deeply about information, understand its implications, and apply this understanding to different contexts. Remember to like and subscribe for more educational content.